Let's, we are going to go ahead and get started with our keynote from Annie Murphy Paul. Very excited for this. Hi, Annie. Annie Murphy Paul is an acclaimed science writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Scientific American, Slate, Time Magazine, and the Best American Science Writing, among many other publications. She is the author of The Extended Mind, chosen as a notable book by the New York Times, the Washington Post, me, and Elise, and many of you. Now she's a senior writer at The Hidden Brain, a podcast and radio program distributed by NPR. Annie is going to present to us on the new rules of thinking. Annie, welcome to Intent to Impact, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dave. And thank you for inviting me to address you all. And thanks to Mark, too, for really having read and digested my book. It's clear that you have, and I'm so flattered and grateful to you for digesting all that material. So here we are talking some more about the extended mind. Let me make sure that I know how to advance my slides here. Is that how okay, got it. Yeah, yep. Okay, so hello, everybody. I'm Annie Murphy Paul. I am a writer who likes to think and write about thinking and learning. In fact, The Extended Mind started out, as books often do, in a very different place. I originally was going to write a book about the science of learning, and in a long and along a long and winding path, it ended up becoming a book about this idea borrowed from philosophy called the extended mind. But I think there's still a lot of the roots of that original book about the science of learning that shows through in the book. And I think that's why a lot of teachers, educators, workplace trainers have found the book useful. So one reason that I ended up arranging the book around the idea of the extended mind is that as a reader and as a writer, what I really love is a big idea that transforms the way that we see the world. If it doesn't have that, I'm not really I'm not really interested. And so my book about the science of learning kind of floundered for a while because I couldn't find the big idea that knitted together all of these interesting research findings that I've been collecting for a while. And so what I did at that point, rather than give up the effort altogether, was I kind of expanded the ambit of my reading and began reading things that were a bit out of my usual sphere. And that's how I ended up reading a philosophy journal and reading in particular this article published in 1998. So it had actually been out for a while by the time I came across it. Published in 1998 by Andy Clark and David Chalmers, these two philosophers. And the article was called The Extended Mind. And this article grabbed me with its very first line, which said, where does the mind end and the rest of the world begin? And this line grabbed me because it was a provocative question and a challenging question, I thought. And it had, at least as I started to think about it, a kind of obvious answer, or at least a conventional answer, which would be, well, the mind stops at the skull, right? Everything outside it is the rest of the world. Our brain, our mind, it's kind of, they're kind of identical, and it's all up here. But Clark and Chalmers were arguing in this article that no, actually, the mind expands beyond the skull into the movements and sensations of our bodies, into the physical spaces in which we learn and work, into our relationships with other people, and also into our tools, into our digital and otherwise, the things we use to make things, to learn with. So that was very interesting to me and ended up being the guiding light that kind of pulled me forward into writing a book. The idea was to sort of operationalize the extended mind, this idea of that I'd come across in this somewhat obscure philosophy journal. Of course, the extended mind has had a life of its own out in the world, and many of you may have encountered it before, but I didn't think it had been popularized to the extent that it should be. I felt like it was such a great idea that it shouldn't be left to the philosophers. It really should belong to the rest of us. And to do that, I needed to figure out and to lay out for readers how exactly we could extend the mind more effectively. Let me go on to the next slide here. Okay. Yeah. So as I mentioned, my first reaction, and I think many people's first reaction to the idea of the extended mind is kind of puzzlement, or a reaction of kind of, well, what does that mean? And that's because we have grown up and live in what Andy Clark calls a brain-bound society, in which we understand thinking to happen inside the brain. And there are a couple of analogies that we use for the mind that really kind of reify and reaffirm that brain-bound ideology. One is that the brain is like a computer, which is a metaphor that, or an analogy that really took off during the cognitive revolution of the middle of the last century. And you can see it popping up in our language and our thinking all the time, that we imagine the brain to be a computer, an information processing machine with information coming in. The brain kind of turns it around and then spits out some information. Or alternatively, we may imagine the brain as a muscle. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the work of Carol Dweck on the growth mindset. And embedded in that very popular idea is the notion that the brain is like a muscle that you exercise. The more you exercise it, the stronger it gets, the smarter you are, the more capable you are. And I'm not at all denigrating the growth mindset. I know it's been very helpful to a lot of people, very optimistic and positive. But I do think that both the brain is like a computer and brain is like a muscle analogies kind of mire us in this idea that the brain is where thinking happens. And that's exactly what the extended mind is challenging. So I started to think, as I began to write the extended mind, what would be an alternative analogy if we weren't imagining the brain as a computer or as a muscle? What would an extended mind analogy for the brain look like? And my first thought that was that it might be something like an orchestra conductor, because I want to be clear, I'm not saying that the brain isn't involved in thinking and learning. It's obviously central, but it's not the only player. It's sort of the director, so to speak, but there's lots of other supporting players. Or alternatively, I thought that perhaps we could liken the brain to a magpie, which is a bird that's famous for taking bits and pieces from its environment and weaving them into its nest, like all birds do. But the magpie is famous for seizing on kind of unusual, shiny bits of wire or tinsel, or all kinds of crazy things have been found in a magpie's nest. And my notion was that, that's kind of what the brain does. Whatever the raw materials are that are available in our environment, that's what we weave into our thinking processes. So that means that the quality of the raw materials to which we have access and our knowledge of how to use those materials really matters in a way that it might not seem to matter so much if we imagine that all thinking happens up here, and that intelligence is a kind of lump of stuff that's sealed in the brain, which is that brain-bound approach that I'd like to challenge with this book. So that brings us to, I think, why we would need a notion like the extended mind. And that comes down to the limits of the biological brain, or what Andy Clark likes to call the naked brain, the brain by itself without these outside the brain resources. It's actually pretty limited, and limited in specific ways. And that isn't always a truth that's appreciated. I think, I am a popular science writer. I read a lot of popular science. I watch a lot of popular science content. And what always strikes me is how much we worship the brain or almost fetishize it. You know, when we picture the brain, when it's depicted in popular culture, it's often like this glowing orb, you know, like floating in space, if it's as if it's some kind of deity or something. And we're always hearing about how amazing the human brain is, how it's the most complicated object in the universe, you know, most complex object in the universe. And all those things are true. But I think by repeating this idea that the brain is so incredible, it can make a lot of us feel, at least it makes me feel like, did I get a bum one? You know, because I know my brain fails me all the time. You know, I forget things. I don't understand things. I find it difficult to learn things. I find it difficult to pay attention. But in fact, all of those limitations that all of us experience and that we see in our students, our children, our colleagues, our employees, those are products of the brain as a biological evolved organ that evolved to do a certain limited number of things, tasks in the physical world that are quite different from what we ask it to do in our modern world of symbols and abstract concepts and just unbelievable quantities of information. And everyone's brains are limited in this way. It's just a product of the organ that we've all inherited from our common, you know, shared evolutionary past. It's not a matter of individual differences or who's smarter than who else. It's a matter of, oh, hey, hello. Oops. Am I still on? That it cut away for a minute. Am I being?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Still here.
Yeah, still here.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Sorry. So everyone can hear me. I can keep going.
Yeah, yeah, all
Okay.
good.
Okay, good. So what was I saying? Oh yeah. So these are limitations that are built into the biological brain. There's a gap between as I said, this world that demands so much of our brains and the built-in natural limits of our biological brains. And that gap it's big and getting bigger. And that's why we need the extended mind to kind of transcend that gap. And so what the extended mind argues is that there are a number of outside the brain resources. Extraneural resources is another phrase that Andy Clark uses, that can help us bridge that gap between what our brains evolved to do and what we ask it to do in our, you know, again, really complex modern world. And those outside the brain resources are, I mentioned them before, but just to go over them again, there are our tools and our devices, our bodies, our physical surroundings, and our relationships. And all of those are outside the brain resources that we can use to think more intelligently and more effectively. So I want to just make the point that we are all already thinking outside the brain in a sense. I mean, I'm gesturing and using my hands. I'm using this, you know, this laptop to talk to you all. We are, I see comments in the chat and we're all, you know, interacting with each other and using each other's minds to think. So it's not that, we're not already extending the mind, but we tend to do so kind of haphazardly and without a lot of intention or skill, precisely because we all grew up in and inhabit this very brain-bound kind of society where, if you think about it, our education, at least the education that I got, was very focused on individual brains, you know, working on their own to solve problems, not necessarily reaching out for these outside the brain resources and not being taught how to do so in an effective way. So it's my belief that in this very complex world where we have such incredibly daunting, you know, wicked problems confronting us, we really need to extend the mind in order to meet the moment. So let's talk a little bit about how we might do that. And my book is actually organized in 3 sections. It talks first about how to extend the mind with the body, then how to extend the mind with physical space, and then how to extend the mind with relationships with other people. So my talk tonight is going to follow that same structure. So I'll say a few words about each. Sorry. In terms of thinking with the body, I think a really important idea to understand is, or to know about, is something called interoception, which is a word that I had not been familiar with before I started researching the book. But I think all of us are familiar with the idea that it refers to, which is a gut intuition, that kind of bodily sense of knowing that is different from a conscious analytical kind of knowing. And that always seemed a little woo-woo to me, the idea of intuition, until I came to understand that there's so much information coming at us all day long as we navigate through our lives. It would be far too much of a burden for our conscious minds to process and store all of that information. And yet we are taking in a lot more information than our conscious minds are attending to. That information gets processed and stored in our non-conscious minds, which then brings up the question of, well, how do we get access to all that non-conscious information, those patterns, those regularities that are being noted on that non-conscious level? And the answer is that it's the body that kind of alerts us to that store of experience and wisdom and knowledge that is kept in our non-conscious mind and then brought into consciousness through bodily signals. So that means that if we cultivate the ability to tune into our interoceptive signals, which might be very subtle, there's just this, flow of internal sensations and cues that I think in our brain-bound world, we're really encouraged to set aside, to push aside and sort of power through and get stuff done, not pay attention to the cues of the body. But if we do tune in to that more subtle flow of information that's always, as I say, coursing through us, and turn away for a moment from all the things that are grabbing for our attention in the outside world, we'll find that we're able to make more effective decisions, that we're able to sense other people's emotions more effectively, that will be more accurate in judging our own states, and thereby, allow ourselves to manage our internal resources more effectively and avoid becoming fatigued or burned out. So a couple of practical approaches for increasing our interoceptive accuracy are a body scan, which I loved that you guys were meditating on your best selves in the session with Mark. I don't know if it was an actual meditation, but a body scan is a type of mindfulness meditation where you pay open-minded, non-judgmental, curious attention to whatever is arising within the body. And you can do that on the meditation cushion in a formal way, or you can do it more informally. And I try a few times throughout the day to check in with my body. I find that, especially in my line of work where I'm reading, writing, on meetings on Zoom, I'm really living in my head. When I'm on Zoom, I'm literally kind of a head in a box, and so is everybody else. So we can really forget almost that we have a body, and we can forget that our bodies have so much to tell us. So I try just several times a day to kind of do that a quick body scan exercise. Another effective approach for getting us in touch with our interoceptive capacity is called affect labeling, which is just applying a label, or ideally several labels, as many descriptive and precise and granular terms that as we can come up with for exactly what it is we're feeling. And this is not, again, getting into the analytical part of the brain. It's just sort of noting and labeling what we're feeling. And research suggests that that can really produce a sense of calm and reduce stress, because it's those feelings that I think are just outside of our awareness. This feeling of of worry or dread or stress that can really drag us down, drain us, but once we've labeled them and kind of embraced them, in a sense, acknowledge their right to exist or their presence in our bodies, I find a real sense of relief from doing that. So another way to think with the body is movement. I always find it very interesting that a lot of us have the notion, and again, it's very much embedded in our culture, that if you want to do serious thinking, real thinking, then what do? You sit down and you stay still, you put your butt in the chair, and you stay there until you get it done. And that's actually, it's a kind of an odd idea when you think about it, because human intelligence really evolved in the context of activities that were both mentally challenging and physically challenging. So if you think about something like hunting or foraging, those are things that draw on our physical resources and our cognitive resources at the same time. We really evolved to think and move at the same time, not to be absolutely still while thinking. So that said, there's some challenges, obviously, to moving a lot while we do the kind of work that a lot of us do at a computer. So one way that I like to bring movement into my workday, my thinking time, is to work at a standing desk, and that promotes what psychologists call micro movements. It's not big muscle movements. It's just little movements of adjusting, your weight from one leg to another, or sort of moving your arms around in a way that doesn't happen so much when we're sitting. Because when we're sitting, we're really giving our bodies the message that we're at rest, whereas there's research that I talk about in the book that shows that when we're actively moving through a landscape, our visual acuity actually gets dialed up. We actually see more clearly when we're on the move. And some radiologists and other people who need to make very fine visual distinctions when they're at work have found that working while on a treadmill actually improves radiologists' ability to identify, very, very tiny abnormalities on the thousands of slides that they have to look at across hours. So when they're sitting, their bodies kind of dial down their visual acuity. When they're moving, when they're on a treadmill, at a walking station, they actually see more clearly. And I think the same is true for a lot of us, that, again, sitting sends our bodies the message that it's time to be at rest. And while moving keeps us alert. Another strategy that works for me is taking a movement break instead of like a coffee break in the middle of the day. I spend so much time sitting and so much time in meetings that I like to turn on music and actually dance around for a few minutes. That's my favorite movement break, and it actually is a real mood lifter also. But again, just think about how much we separate. This is very much reflective of the way we separate mind and body in our culture. We separate physical movement from mental activity. We might work all day at our desks and then go to the gym, instead of incorporating movement into our workday, into our thinking time. So it's useful, I think, to think about a walking meeting is another way that we might incorporate movement into our thinking time. And I think it's often the case that we'll find that our thinking is improved as a result. Let me just go on to the next slide. Okay, and the final way that we can that I'll talk about in terms of how we can think with our bodies is through gesture. So I think, if any of us think about gesture, and most of us don't, because our culture really values verbal expression. We're so focused on what people say that we don't, if we do think about gesture, we think of it as this kind of add-on, to what's really important, which is the words that people are saying. But in fact, linguists think that gesture came first as in our human evolution, that we probably communicated with other people using gesture first, and then language only came along later. And we see this recapitulated in the life of every infant. And I know David has a new baby, and so he may be seeing this, but babies gesture and communicate with their hands before they are able to speak. And that sort of the place that gesture holds in our sort of communication armamentarium, that first place, that pride of place that gesture has, that stays with us all through our lives, in the sense that researchers have found that our gestures are actually a few milliseconds ahead of what we're saying in terms of what we're trying to express, especially when we're trying to capture an idea in words, reach for something, explain something, and we can't quite get it in words yet. Often that idea will show up in our hands first, and that gives our those who are listening to us or watching us a kind of preview of what we're going to say, and it actually helps ourselves kind of pull out from ourselves the words that we're looking for. We're actually reading information off our own hands. So when people's hands are restricted, like in experimentally, when people have to not move their hands, it turns out that they speak less fluently and explain things less cogently, because our hands are actually doing some of the work. And so it's really unfortunate that our culture kind of discourages often the use of gesture. It's seen as sort of, mindless hand waving, or gauche maybe in some way. So what we really want to be doing is encouraging others and giving license to ourselves to gesture as much as possible. I like to, I'll do it right now, kind of move, when I'm on Zoom, kind of move my camera a little bit away from me, so that my gestures can be seen along with just my face. And I sometimes ask people to do the same when I'm looking at them. There's also very interesting research to suggest that people learn more from instructional videos that include a person, an instructor whose hands are visible and who's moving their hands, rather than just being a talking head or maybe a hand writing on a whiteboard. So now when I look for instructional videos for myself or my kids, I look for those that include a lot of gesture. So moving on from the body to spaces, and it sounds like you talked a little bit about that in Mark's presentation. I want to start with a very particular kind of space, which is the outdoors. And I'll go back again to this idea of what we evolved to do. Our forebears evolved in nature. This modern world where we live inside, we spend almost all our time inside a building or a car, is evolutionarily speaking, very recent. We actually, spent our species has spent the great majority of its time outside. And that means that our brains are really tuned to the kind of to take in and process very easily, very effortlessly, the kind of information or stimuli that we encounter when we're outside. And I think we all kind of have that feeling, when you go outside and you just take a deep breath and you find that your attention, psychologists call this diffuse attention. It's not the very hard edged, very intentional kind of attention that we have to pay to our work when we're, manipulating symbols or words or looking at a screen or looking at a piece of paper. When we're outside, our attention is diverted in pleasant ways. We notice a tree over here or some clouds moving over here. It's a very relaxing and pleasant and affectively pleasant, experience to pay attention outside. And it turns out that has an effect on our attention. Researchers call it the attention restoration effect, which is we effectively spend down our attentional resources when we're focusing so intently at work. We don't think a lot about how to replenish those resources. We think a lot in terms of the demands on our attention, but not about replenishing the supply. But it turns out that the quickest, easiest, most effective way to replenish our stores of attention is just to spend a little time outside. Even if we don't have time for that, spending some time looking out the window, looking at greenery, can have some of the same effect. So that is another thing that I've definitely incorporated into my own life. I try to walk whenever I can, take a walk during the work day, or I have a big, beautiful tree in my front yard, and I find myself just sort of looking out the window whenever I can and allowing my attention to sort of, in a very diffuse, relaxed way, kind of take in that natural scenery as a counterpoint or an alternative to the other kind of attention that I'm paying to my work. So even though we did evolve in the outdoors, and it is really good for our minds to be outdoors, we are inside most of the time, at least I am. And so it's worthwhile thinking about how can we design our interior environments to support intelligent thinking, to extend our mind with interior space. And so research has told us some things about what kinds of interior spaces support intelligent thinking. And I like to say that this is one of the places where I think that brain as computer metaphor really falls down, where we really see the flaws in that conceptualization. Because this laptop here that I'm using to talk to you on, it functions just the same way here in my home office as it would if I were to take it outside and work in a park. It doesn't care. It doesn't matter to my computer where that computer is located. But human brains are very different. They're actually exquisitely sensitive to context. So we think differently in different spaces. So back to how to design our interior spaces for sort of maximally intelligent thinking. We know that when people have a feeling of ownership and control over their space, they think better, more effectively in that space, which is something that kind of worries me about this trend towards hot desking or, kind of flexible space in offices. When the desk that you have today wasn't the desk that you had yesterday, and it won't be the desk that you have tomorrow. I kind of wonder, I do have some questions about how much ownership and control people can feel over a space that isn't really theirs. But for those of us who work at home like I do, or have an office where they can appoint in ways that are meaningful to them, I find it useful to think in terms of what psychologists call evocative objects, which is when you look around, when you're working, when you're in your space where you're creating and thinking, when you look around, what do you see? And there are two main categories of evocative objects that can really help prime intelligent thinking. One of them is cues of identity, which is, of course, we all have many identities. We're family members, we're friends, we're citizens, but when we're working, we want to prime or activate a very, particular group of identities. I'm a creator, I'm a writer, I'm a thinker, I'm a podcast producer, so we want to have cues that remind us of those valued identities, right in front of our eyes, to kind of almost reaffirm who we are in that space, especially maybe if we work at home and our home serves, a bunch of we're many different people in our homes. So we want to, in our home offices, surround ourselves with cues of who we are at work. The second category is cues of belonging, which can help us remember that we're a part of valued groups, that we're connected to other people, even if we happen to be working alone. Reminders of the tangible physical objects of those group memberships can make us feel more secure and more powerful than if we feel like we're all by ourselves. So memorabilia that remind us of our colleges or our workplace associations, or other people or organizations that that we're connected to. Those are all kinds of cues that we want to have around us. And I think it's also worth thinking for those of us who work in offices and have some control over public spaces, to think about what kind of cues of identity and belonging are you providing for people who enter your space? Are you when people come into your space, do they feel a sense of what psychologists call ambient belonging? Do they have a sense that this is a place where they are welcome? So I don't think we always think about the appointments of our office that way, but I think that can be a very useful lens to think about. So finally, I want to talk about what I think of as thinking with the space of ideas. And I think this really ties in very much with what Mark was saying about mural, that, again, in our brain-bound society where we think that we imagine that thinking all happens up here, we really overvalue, I think, doing things in our heads. We admire people who, can keep a whole lot of information in their heads or do complicated math problems in their heads. We admire people like memory champions or chess grandmasters who can sort of plan out things and remember things in their heads. But it turns out that it's often more efficient and more effective to get as much of that information and ideas out of our heads as possible and spread them out on physical space, which could mean a big whiteboard. It could mean a bunch of Post-it notes that we move around. It could mean a multi-monitor setup with our computer. I was saying earlier that our brains evolved to do a very small number of things easily and well. And some of those things that we evolved to do are to feel and move the body, to navigate through three-dimensional landscapes, to manipulate physical tools. And yet instead, what we spend most of our time doing is thinking about abstract symbols. So the more we can make ideas and information like a landscape that we navigate through, or like physical objects that we manipulate, the more we can bring our natural embodied resources to our thinking. So when you think about, laying a whole bunch of information out on a whiteboard, we do kind of navigate through it like a three-dimensional landscape. We can walk along it, we can zoom in or zoom out. And I don't mean zoom in the sense of using our computer, but actually physically we can focus in or take a step back. And when we are using things like Post-it notes, which is my personal favorite for planning out articles and chapters, we're physically moving pieces of information and putting them into place in a way that really requires a lot of cognitive bandwidth to do all of that in our heads. And that's that much less cognitive bandwidth or resources that we have for applying to the thinking itself. So the more we can sort of offload, and the term in psychology is cognitive offloading, the more we can offload that piece of the project, remembering things and keeping them in mind, as the more we can offload that onto physical space, the more we can use our higher level cognitive powers for the thinking itself. So on to the final section here. Let me just check what time it is. Okay, we're good. Which is thinking with other people. I mentioned earlier how our culture really likes to separate mind and body. This goes way back. Whoops, did not mean to. To Descartes and before, this idea that mind and body are separate. But I think a corollary to that is that we separate social relational activity on the one hand from intellectual and academic and mental activity on another. So again, just like, we sit still all day and then we at work and then we go to the gym afterwards, we tend to burrow ourselves in our little cubicles or desks during the day, and then maybe we'll go to a happy hour at the end of the day. Whereas I think we want to think in terms of integration and harnessing the power of the social brain in service of learning, because of course human beings are fundamentally social, deeply social, and we're social all the time, not just at happy hour, but also when we're thinking. In fact, thinking itself is a kind of internalized conversation. Linguists think that the way that we think to ourselves in our heads is actually a kind of internalized conversation. Of course, we learn language in the context of relationships and other people. And so thinking is itself already, even if we're alone, a very social process. So we want to think in terms of leveraging the social brain in the service of thinking. And some of the ways we can do that is to build explicitly social activities into our thinking, into our work days. Some of my favorites among those would be like storytelling, debating, teaching others, teaching peer-to-peer can be especially effective. And I'll just put in a plug here for storytelling in particular, which I'm sure I don't need to sell to you all, but I find it so fascinating that stories, the human brain seem to have evolved to take in and express information in story format, such that we pay more attention to information when it's embedded in a story. We remember it better. We're more likely to act on it. So whenever so much of the information that we encounter especially in our work lives, is sort of expository. It doesn't draw on this really powerful engine of story. So the more we can communicate through story, the bigger an impact that we're going to have on our listeners. So I think one of the big cultural assumptions that the extended mind is pushing back on is our culture's obsession with individualism. The idea that each of us has this brain that's sealed inside our skulls, and if we have an idea, it's our idea, which again is really not, it's both not accurate. Ideas arise among people, and it's also another way in which I think our ways of thinking about thinking haven't really kept up with the challenges of our modern world. There's so much information out there. It's so complex. It's so specialized that we need to increasingly figure out how to think as a group because no one person can kind of make discoveries or come up with ideas on their own anymore. Not that they can't ever do it, but I mean, we're in a place now where we actually need to bring people together to create a kind of group mind in order to get the most out of the mental resources of all the people involved. So psychologists talk about a condition that they call groupiness. That's actually a term that psychologists use. And what they mean by that is that it's the state of being, and I think all of us have experienced this at times and have experienced its absence. It's the moment when a group of individuals becomes its own entity, when it's no longer a collection of individuals, but sort of one mind. And we all have had that experience of being in a group and feeling like, oh, wow, we're all on the same page. We're all kind of taking part in this mental activity together. And what's interesting to me is that, although, as I was just saying, it's the modern world that really demands the group mind. The ways to achieve the group mind are very primitive and visceral. Our minds and bodies respond to things like synchronous movement. When people are moving in the same way at the same time in the same place, our brains kind of have a sense that we're all part of one entity. That's why militaries have their armies march together, or religions have people perform rituals in which they're all moving in the same way at the same time, or even when people dance together, they can achieve that same feeling of that we're one body or one mind. And in terms of applying that to the workplace, even things like taking a walk together, when people walk side by side, they tend to fall into a synchronous rhythm. And research shows that when people have taken a walk together, they tend to then be better able to cooperate and collaborate because they've through a process of putting their bodies in sync, they kind of have put their minds in sync as well. But things like sharing very meaningful or emotional experiences, taking the time to sort of share what's going on in our personal lives, with appropriate boundaries, of course, can be a way to bond people together. And also rituals like sharing a meal together. And these are, some of the things that we lose, I think, when we are totally remote. So I am actually a fan of getting people together in person whenever possible. So I'll just say a couple words now, and I think I'm getting close to the end of the presentation, so I really welcome your questions. Please give a thought if to whether you have something you'd like to ask or bring up, because I'd love to hear it. I'll just say a few words about a transactive memory system, which is a bit of a clunky name, but I think it's a really useful concept. The idea goes back to what I was saying a moment ago about how no one person, our projects, our enterprises are so complex, so specialized these days that no one person can hold in their minds everything that is needed to be known about that project. But you can effectively multiply your access to information and knowledge and memory when you know who to go to for that information. That's why a robust transactive memory system in which everyone in a group has an accurate and updated sense of who knows what, where to direct, the information as it comes in, who to go to when a gap in your own knowledge is identified. Those transactive memory systems are more important than ever. And there's some really interesting research suggesting that, for example, groups of doctors who have a robust transactive memory system among themselves, who know who knows what, their patients do better and are released from the hospital earlier. So there's actually very concrete, practical benefits from having a group mind in which people are not only thinking together, but they know what individuals in the group know exclusively to themselves. Again, it's kind of like you're multiplying your access to information by having access to other brains. So just a few words in conclusion. I first learned about the idea of the extended mind, it must have been 10 years ago now. And unlike other projects and other things I've written about, I just I've never gotten tired of this idea. I just find it so endlessly interesting, fascinating. And one of the things that I love about it is that it opens up such a world, literally a world of options and choices, because it says that we don't have to think just with what's up here. We can think with all of this that's out here, and although it can sound a bit like a kind of out there, far out, space age kind of idea. Another thing that I love about it is that it actually is bringing us back to who we always were as human beings. We are embodied creatures who are embedded in physical spaces and connected to other people who use tools as part of our thinking. And the idea that we're just brains, brains in vats or heads in boxes, that was always the mistake. To the extended mind is really just putting us back in touch with what was always true. So that's something I really enjoy about it. As I've mentioned, it allows us to transcend the limits of the biological brain, which are fixed. But even as the capacities of our brains are really fixed, even as the world grows more complicated. And finally, I love that it's a skill that everyone can cultivate. There's nothing innate about it. In fact, if there is anything innate about it, it's that all of us are predisposed to extend our minds as human beings. To extend the mind is a very human endeavor. And in fact, that's how I approach new technologies like artificial intelligence, for example, that this is of course, there are scary or challenging elements of something like AI, but in a way, you can see it as simply the latest iteration of human beings extending their minds with resources that lie outside the skull. So I think if we can think of ourselves, as Andy Clark says, the philosopher who came up with the idea of the extended mind, as intrinsically loopy creatures who benefit from looping our thought processes through other media, through our bodies, through um, spaces, through the minds of other people, through our devices and tools. Our thoughts come back to us in an enhanced and enriched way, in a way that they would not if our thoughts just stayed sort of inert and alone in our heads. So that is my presentation for today. Here's some information about how to get in touch with me. And now I would absolutely love to talk with you guys. I think it looks like there's a lot of stuff in the chat.
There is, yeah. Annie, thank you so much. That
Yeah.
was fantastic. We really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's after hours. It's a little late for you, but question. And going back, I think it was one slide or two slide about the face-to-face. A lot
Yes.
of this project was about, does face-to-face enhance creativity? Does it enhance collaboration? Should we be doing our work on Zoom?
Yes.
You said getting together face-to-face. You can't replicate the signal processing that happens. You can't replicate that online.
Yeah.
Is that from a social, in a bonding standpoint, or is that from a thinking? Does it enhance our thinking, or does it enhance our social bonding, or is there an overlap there?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. I mean, from what I have gathered from the research, and of course, it's still pretty nascent, but I would say that it's mostly social, and that's not to say that the social piece isn't really important, because it
Of
really
course.
is. Yeah, and the two areas that I have seen in the literature in terms of what suffers when we are online rather than in person are, first of all, young people really do suffer from not getting the tacit knowledge that you pick up from being with experts, and I think all of us who've, kind of apprenticed to a profession know that so much of what you learn is not direct instruction, but just sort of picking up how people talk, how they carry themselves, how they address themselves to problems. And you're not going to get a lot of that if you're just having sort of very instrumental, task-oriented meetings. So I really, I am concerned about young people who start their careers in remote jobs. I just think that's not at all ideal. The other thing that is lost, as far as I can see in the research, in terms of when we're online, is interestingly trust. The bonds of trust among people. When you think about, that's another human experience is really more implicit than explicit. I mean, you pick up whether you can trust someone, you get a feel for who someone is by watching them in moments when you're not directly addressing them, like when you might see them, how they greet someone, or how they handle a frustration, and those repeated tiny interactions, and seeing what a person is really made of. That's what allows you to trust someone. And when you're just getting on a meeting, tackling a particular problem, jumping off Zoom, you're not developing that really rich database of, oh, I really know this person. I know I can trust them. So it appears that trust does suffer in purely online enterprises.
Okay. We had a question earlier from Mark about the quality of human interaction with AI chatbots. Mark, do you want to just add some color to
Yeah, I
that?
was just thinking when you were talking about invoking the social mind,
Yeah.
and I've read so many articles about people that maybe they're hopeless introverts or something, but they engage with these natural language models that are very comforting to them, and they begin to develop trust and reliance and everything. Is there any data we have on that being engaged, human versus AI at any level? That is it just the engagement's there because it's feeding off the human need, but even if the quality is not there, is there something to be
Yeah,
yeah.
that's such an interesting question, Mark. I mean, I'm not aware of any research. I think a lot of this is just too new, but I think that's a fascinating question, in part because to me it throws us back on the fact of how deeply social humans are, that we can even with a non-living being that of course humans created, we bring all of these social resources, and we can spin a whole relationship out of our own responses to our to human like input. But again, I'm really convinced that our bodies play such an important role in establishing and maintaining our relationships. And one of my favorite concepts that I came across in writing The Extended Mind was this idea of social interoception, which is the idea that we really get a sense of what other people are feeling by paying attention to our own bodies. Because, of course, other people's minds are like a black box to us. We can't directly know what another person is feeling. But by subtly mimicking, and this is something we all do, especially when we're in person with someone, subtly mimicking our interlocutors' facial expressions and gestures and demeanor and posture, we pick up in ourselves, we read off our own bodies some sense of what they are feeling. And I think we've all had that experience when you're talking to someone who's very sad or depressed, or someone who's very angry. We might start to, it's contagious. We actually feel some of that in ourselves, and that channel is embodied. And so I think I would argue to really understand someone, really kind of make that very intimate connection. At least it really helps to be in person, to be two bodies in a space.
Yeah, I didn't understand or appreciate Kuvad until my spouse got pregnant, and then suddenly I'm like, wow, what's his pain? What's his, you just have this empathy
Yeah,
feelings,
yeah, yeah. Love that.
Curtis, you had a question about cultural awareness.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I come from Cuban people. We use our hands a lot, and the Italians do, and other cultures do. I wondered, Annie, whether you'd done some cross-cultural comparative studies, or I was even thinking of indigenous cultures. What have we lost? Descartes said cogito ergo sum, but there's been this split. What do you think we can learn from indigenous communities as well, or just cross-culturally? Did Japanese or Swedes or anyone else do this better, as far as you can tell?
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you for asking, Curtis. I know that gesture researchers, when I've talked to them, they say that people always ask them about Italians. Like that's like they always get that question because there's that. Well, maybe we could say stereotype, but I think it actually is a cultural difference that some cultures use their hands more than others. I'm not aware of research that says anything about, whether some people from some cultures learn better than others or think better than others because they're using their hands more. But again, this goes back for me to our fundamental nature as human beings, that all of us have this capacity. And so it's a capacity that all of us can develop. And so a couple of the suggestions that I offer in the book for increasing our use of gesture. One is to to put people on the spot, because it's really difficult. It's very cognitively challenging to improvise, to come up with something on the spot, or to explain something that we're still trying to understand, rather than. And research shows that people gesture more when they're trying to grasp or explain something that they haven't quite gotten, as opposed to explaining something that they already fully understand. They tend not to gesture quite as much, because when we are really wrestling with an idea, we're offloading some of that work onto our hands. So we can, teachers or parents can sort of say to students or kids, why don't you try moving your hands when you talk about that? Another thing that we can do to increase our own and others' gestures is that people gesture more when there's something to gesture at, like an object or a model or a chart or a graph. So we can provide artifacts that become sort of like a incentive to gesture. So I'm not sure I can really answer the cross-cultural question, but as a species, we're all inclined to gesture, and to the extent that there's inhibitions or encouragements in cultures to gesture or not, I think we can create our own little sort of micro cultures that encourage and elicit gesture.
I think we have time for one more. Martine, you've posed a question here in the chat that I think is kind of the subtext to all of this research here around the optimization here. But please ask.
My question was, we are thinking about what is the impact of the virtual working and working remotely, and do you have an idea of the optimal balance between physical and virtual working? Or is your viewpoint physical when you can? I don't know. I'm just really curious.
That's a great question, and there I turned to some really interesting research on what's known as intermittent collaboration, which is the idea that well, not just idea, but the evidence that suggests that people there are advantages and disadvantages both to thinking alone and to thinking in groups, and that the optimal arrangement is to be able to oscillate between the two of them. When we're alone, we can come up with lots of fresh ideas that are not sort of subject to pressures of conformity or social consensus, but we don't then get the advantage of the sparks that can come when we're that can emerge when we're collaborating with other people. And it turns out that again, that the best arrangement seems to be to be able to move back and forth between those two states. And then I think it becomes a question of, or a matter of creating spaces that support each of those kinds of thinking. And it seems to me like the hybrid environment where maybe we do our private deep work, our thinking on our protected thinking in solitude at home, and then the office becomes a place where that is specifically oriented and designed to support collaborative, cooperative thinking. That I see a lot of companies moving in that direction, and I think that might be a good description of what an office is for. If people can work at home, what is the point of coming in and seeing other people? And I think that kind of promoting that kind of oscillation, that intermittent collaboration might be a good answer. One good answer.
Thank you, Annie.
This was fun.
Fantastic. If you haven't read the book, I suggest you do. I know I'm going to go back and reread. Just pick a page. Just pick a page, and there will be something there. I promise. Given who is here, something will speak to you. We're going to do another quick 2-minute break. We'll come back, and we're going to get into our closing activity.
We've got a surprise for you.
We do.
So we've built a little fun thing for you. So take a water, take a dance. Julie will put on some music. We'll be right back.